most of us haven't grown up with this openness about sex, even though I say we're in this sex saturated world where there's stuff everywhere. So it's okay to say to yourself, this feels really uncomfortable. And also, by the way, you don't have to watch porn or say you like porn to have a conversation about porn. Just like perhaps you're a non-drinker and you're having a conversation with your young people in the house about, hey, we don't drink or we don't do drugs. So this is a conversation around, there's this thing, you're going to see it, probably very likely, and they'll either search for it themselves or they'll accidentally find it. So I think that's important to know, that we can also get comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations.
Welcome back to another episode of the Rebel Love podcast. Today, my guest is Naomi Hutchings, a clinical sexologist and relationship counsellor currently working in Brisbane, Australia. She's been working in the field of human sexuality for over 17 years, has a master's degree in health science in sexual health from the University of Sydney, an arts degree with a double major in gender and politics, and she's currently completing a postgraduate degree in counselling. Naomi started her work out of a strong desire to improve what she determined to be inadequate sexual health education and relationship curriculum in Australia. Welcome, Naomi. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I am really, really excited today to talk to you. We're going to talk about why porn literacy should be talked about more at home, which I think is just such an important topic. And I've been really, really excited to speak to you about this. But before we jump into it, can you tell us a little bit about your story and how you became a clinical sexologist and relationship counsellor?
Look, I kind of fell into it, I think. I had an unplanned pregnancy when I was 16. So I became a mama at 17 years old, and I'd been at a Catholic school, and pretty much my sex education was nil, other than don't have sex until you're married kind of stuff. So I think back then, you couldn't even go to uni unless you were a mature age student. Like if you'd left school and you didn't get year 12, which I had to because I had a baby, I had to wait and become a mature age student. So at 21, I went to uni, and that's kind of, I fell into, I think they called it women's studies then. Now they use the term gender studies, but it was women's studies and politics. And I kept looking into things, teenage pregnancies and stuff, a whole bunch of different things. And it got me really kind of thinking about like the inadequate sexual health education system here. And how I think it lets people down. So that's sort of how I kind of started looking at that. And then I started doing volunteer work with young people, trying to do different bits of training. So I was doing a lot of training with Sexual Health Service that I ended up running that training myself years later. But I ended up becoming, after lots of volunteer stuff, lots of training, I became like a community health worker, which is a sex educator in a sexual health service. And so when I did my master's, I got accepted into that master's because of all my work experience. So yeah, did the master's. And so really I've been I was even at one point in Adelaide teaching a human sexuality course. So just sort of been doing lots of different things, but now mostly I just do face-to-face or online counselling with individuals or couples. So that's been happening other than things like this podcast, and I do Triple J sometimes on Sunday nights, but I've kind of sort of been doing lots of PD all the time. And then as you were saying, I have started or nearly finished the counselling degree. I just had to put it on hold because there's some personal stuff, but I did that just because I feel like it's nice having this extra sort of stuff. I'm constantly doing PD or anything I can find, so I'm always doing things like that. So that's sort of how I got into it. Very patchy. It's been a sort of long journey, but I've always been doing something around sexual health and relationships for all that time.
Yeah, wow. So you've had the first-hand experience of, going through, I guess, the lack of support.
Sure.
Would you describe it as?
Yeah, and I think it was like that. A lot of sex ed, and I think it's still like this today in some places, is just like how to not get an STI and how to not get pregnant. And it just doesn't talk about all the other things, relationships, consent, and just also acknowledging that young people have sexual feelings and that young people can actually make good decisions and stuff like that. So, all of that, I just felt like, and now it's really ad hoc. Now it's just, there's nothing that's Australia-wide that's the same. So everywhere you go, people are going to get different stuff.
Yeah, there's no standard way of teaching it. I actually don't remember at school. I was actually talking to one of my girlfriends about this recently. I don't remember my mother having that conversation with me, to be honest. And I also don't remember learning anything about it at
Hmm.
school. I went to a public
Hmm.
school, and yeah, there was nothing. I mean, maybe we talked about, like you said, STIs and that
Yeah,
kind
it's
of
all the
thing.
scaremongering or just like biology stuff, which I mean, it's important to have discussions about them, but not make that be the only thing.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah, and no one talked about sex. Certainly, no one was having the consent conversation back in when I was
Yeah.
younger.
No.
Yeah, it's kind of really shocking to think of it, isn't it?
It
Really.
is, I think, yeah. And I think I spend a lot of time often with clients who are older now and they're looking back, obviously, with Me Too movement going on and a whole bunch of other stuff. We are talking about sexual assault and things a lot more, even though it's still not great, but we are having the conversation a lot more. And now so many people are looking back and going, oh my gosh, there was no consent there. I'm having so many of those conversations.
Yeah, yeah. It's I don't know. It's just so shocking now. But I think maybe because there's been so much, I guess it doesn't feel like it, but progress with Me
Hmm.
Too. Like that's like the
Yeah.
start. So let's talk a little bit about sexual
Hmm.
intelligence. We spoke about this when we had our intro
Yeah.
call. Can you tell us a little bit about what sexual intelligence is?
So, I mean, I think the term was coined by Marty Klein, who's an American psychosexual therapist, I think he calls himself. He has been around for ages and he's written some great books. And I have done a bit of his training and sort of had a lot of dialogue with him because I kind of really felt quite drawn to we had similar thoughts about things. You know, he talks about porn panic and stuff like that. So he wrote a book about that. But basically, the term, in a nutshell, how I like to look at it, really is that um, when we want to be sexually intelligent, just meaning, do we know, where do we get our values from? You know, the sex that we're having, are we having sex because we think we should do it this way? And also getting correct information that's not full of judgy stuff, but actual scientific facts. Yeah, all of that in a nutshell, just meaning so that you can make really good informed decisions that aren't based on what some people say that we should be doing, but and also that, yeah, that we get to think and be curious about where we get our ideas about sex from. That's kind of how I sort of see it.
So you mentioned porn panic before. Did I hear that
Yeah.
correctly?
Yep.
Can you? I just want to ask
So I feel
what's
like
that?
this is the thing where people panic, and so it's all this whole moralistic judgment stuff going on. Instead of actually being really sensible about what's going on, they basically go to the word, and often they say really catchy words like pornification of this, and and I think, and they use those titles and get into spaces where people are already freaking out about young people having sex and things like that. So there's this panic that, basically, I feel like they're very binaries. It's like all porn is bad. There is no nuance. There's no conversation. There's just stop doing it, that kind of stuff. And so that's what I talk about, like moral panic. It's like, oh, we're going to stop this. There's something wrong. And so I call it the porn panic.
Right, right. Okay. I haven't heard that before. That's great. So I'm really excited to talk about this in the context of people with
Mm,
children. I guess this is like a great segue because if they do find out their child is watching porn or have some
mm.
curiosity, I guess, how do we kind of raise that sexual intelligence in our children and have that conversation?
I mean, look, I think the thing we need to realize is the internet's not going anywhere. Okay, so also for a really long time in history, way before the internet, people have enjoyed or got aroused by watching other people have sex. Okay, it just happened in different ways. Now we've got the internet; it's here to stay, and there's some really bad things about the internet, but also some fabulous things. Right, the fact that we're doing this is part of that whole technology thing, but um, I think we need to know that it's here, that people will continue to make porn because people want to see it. So I think in trying to pretend it's not there or just shut off the conversation is not helpful. I don't think that's helpful at all.
Right.
It's like and also I suppose that conversation around thinking we have to have one conversation with a young people or children about the sex talk or whatever. That's not how I look at it. I look at it as an ongoing conversation. So,
Hmm.
just as I'm sure there's many parents or caregivers listening who already have things set up about, I suppose there's all these techie things that you can do to stop your children accessing certain things. At some point, they're probably going to see it. They're going to see something that is adults being sexual, right? And so we need to have the lines of communication open so they can have a discussion to deal with whatever feelings they are for seeing something. Because it's not just going to be porn. If they're on the internet, they're going to see other things that aren't great too. So it's like you want to have the lines of communication open so they can come to you and say, I saw this, what does this mean? Because they're children seeing adults doing things and they don't have the same ability to rationalize what's going on and that this isn't real and stuff like that, even though it's real people, you know?
Yeah, totally. Well, it's interesting as well that you say that about like porn specifically, because like you said, there's sexuality everywhere in advertisements on Instagram. And what's kind of crazy to me is that you can't show a female nipple on Instagram. You can show a male one, but that you can show pretty much everything else of a female's body. A woman in a G-string wearing a bra that barely covers her nipples, but you can't show her actual nipple, which is just so
it's
strange.
bizarre. I think the genderless nipples on Instagram, that was that page that started that, where people would just highlight areolas and a nipple and you couldn't work out what's the gender. So it was this thing of pushing it at Instagram, pushing back at them for doing that.
Yeah, I saw this meme of a woman with a male's nipples posted on her boobs.
I've seen that.
That was really, I was like,
absolutely. It's like, there's a really good sort of section about 10 images of someone like literally going in for surgery and cutting off and putting different nipples on so they can walk outside.
Yeah, it's it's everywhere. So like I love the idea that we need to talk to our children about this on an ongoing basis. So I imagine that is, for some parents this is going to be easier than others. If you find yourself a parent and it's incredibly confronting, where's a good place to start with your child?
I think it's important just to acknowledge that it probably is going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people, because most of us haven't grown up with this openness about sex, even though I say we're in this sex saturated world where there's stuff everywhere. So it's okay to say to yourself, this feels really uncomfortable. And also, by the way, you don't have to watch porn or say you like porn to have a conversation about porn. You know, that's the thing I say to people. It's okay. We can have a conversation about this. Just like perhaps you're a non-drinker and you're having a conversation with your young people in the house about, hey, we don't drink or we don't do drugs, this stuff. So this is a conversation around, there's this thing, you're going to see it, probably very likely, and they'll either search for it themselves or they'll accidentally find it. And how do we have a conversation about that? So I think that's important to know that we can also get comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations.
Okay, so how do we start the uncomfortable conversation?
Look, I feel like I often say to people, you don't have to, if you're doing this and you've got younger people, start the conversation. Like sex education is not just about, people often go, oh my God, you're telling kids how to have sex. That's not it. It's just an ongoing conversation, like starting with genitals, naming them correctly. And also if you see your child masturbating, to talk to them and not shame them and just say, oh, okay, yeah, that feels good. But we don't do that at the table, just like we don't pick our nose or fart at the table, that kind of stuff. Have this sort of conversation. So I suppose there's that. But if you're talking specifically about porn, I suppose that's part of your conversation, I imagine, with your child having access to things, phones and the smartphones and stuff, sort of saying, hey, sometimes you might find things that make you uncomfortable. And so if you want to talk about it, can you come and, have a chat to me? I'm happy to talk to you about this. So there's lots of ways you can start that conversation, because obviously there's many things. I'm sure parents are already having to have really uncomfortable conversations like stranger danger or not putting too much information on the internet, because what people can do, and they're uncomfortable, right? They're not nice conversations. And people often say that to me, well, I feel bad and they're losing their innocence. And I'm like, yeah, okay, but we also still have to have this conversation because this happens.
Right.
So porn is there. And so we can have a conversation saying, you might see this, then they're adults, and it may be really confusing because they're doing things that look like the person's getting hurt, or they're making sounds, and they're kissing and doing all these things. And so having a conversation about what are you thinking about this, and also describing to them that, just like you might accidentally see a horror movie and it's really scary and it was acting, and, talking through those things.
Yeah, that's I really like that comparison.
There are people who pay, I don't, but there are people who go to cinemas and pay good money to sit in there and be scared shitless. And I get it. They just get a high, but most of them leave there and don't go out and do it. They go there for the
Mm-hmm.
whole adrenaline rush or whatever, like people go on roller coasters and stuff. But for some people, they pay, or now there's still free stuff, porn. So I suppose it's just about trying to have a discussion around that. Sex can feel really good, and also people like to watch sex, so you can do this just like you can pick a certain genre of other things to find on the internet, you know.
Okay, that brings me into a question then about I know as we know, not people in porn. I'd say, I mean, I don't know the stats, but probably 90% of the time are
Yeah.
acting,
Mm-hmm.
not actually
Mm-hmm.
enjoying it. So how do we have that conversation of, hey, look, because we don't want children learning, and this is what's happening, right? People are normalizing this as normal
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
sex, and that's not always the
Yeah.
case.
So
So
look, and if you ever look at, there's research is so conflicting, and sometimes you can tell that there's been money put into some research from some really anti-porn people have coming out, because there's also some stuff that came out that for some people, particularly queer folk, who were like they'd never seen two men have sex, and so they were like, oh, that's what happens, you know, because no one talks about that because the comprehensive sex ed isn't there and inclusive, right? But it's also just about saying that they are real people and they are having sex, but they're acting out a scene. There are people you can't see behind the scene with lights and a camera. They take a break, so they're also acting like just in another thing you might see on TV, that they drift their cars and race like that, and you wouldn't actually do that on the streets, your streets near where you live, kind of thing. So it's about talking about that. And also, I suppose, and the older they get, having conversations about, this is what I talk about when I say, porn literacy, and what does that mean, is that, we want to get critical. We want young people to be critical thinkers and looking at the images. And again, not just porn, in all of the stuff, like you mentioned before, Instagram, all the other things, knowing that things are edited. This is a snapshot of not real life.
right.
So I often talk about porn sex versus real sex. It means here, the real sex. So yeah, those actors in there are being sexual, but also they're acting out a scene. Real life sex is, let's have a conversation. What do you like? What do I like? And how do we say no?
Right.
And all of those things, plus
Mm-hmm.
diversity and things like that they're picked because they look that way, certain ways often. That's
Mm-hmm.
what you'll see, so that not
Yes.
everybody has penises that big, and all of that stuff. But having a conversation, who's got the power in there, and often a lot of it, depending on what porn you're watching, will look very much skewed to men overpowering women and all of that
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that the women often have had surgical
Totally.
enhancements,
Mm-hmm.
and and that they do things so that you can't see their
Yeah,
cellulite, and so
absolutely.
women have this idea that if they do want to be in a heterosexual relationship, and that's what is they are watching, that they should model that person, or or enjoy it like she enjoys it. I
Yes.
remember watching porn when I was younger, and I was just like, I I don't know. I just don't make those noises, and
No.
she doesn't look like she's really enjoying
Yes,
it,
yes.
you know?
And that's kind of also trying to have a conversation that sometimes people are part of that sex play in that scene is something like that, acting out something where the person is at, but they've talked about it beforehand. There's all this stuff that's really tricky. So we say this is why it's really important that you're able to talk to us about it, so I can explain to you what's really going on here, that in real life you would have had, things don't go like that. And that it's okay to make noises, but also sometimes they're making extra noises just because it's for the show. Yeah.
Yep. Totally, totally. Oh, this is really great. So, okay, so this kind of in-depth conversation, now obviously we want to be age appropriate with our young
Mm,
people. How like you talked about before about like it being an ongoing
mm.
conversation. When could we get to the point where we could kind of go in depth? Like when would
Look,
that
I
be
just feel
appropriate?
like also, every child is a little different, and the parents probably know their child better than me. So I often say sometimes though, just, people say they'll ask you questions. So often kids will come up and say things like, what's an orgasm? I heard about that. So you can just talk about what that is. But also some children are not like they don't ask, they're thinking about it. And so I suppose it's about, also I say to parents and caregivers, you can use certain things as opportunities to open some dialogue. So maybe they got the radio and something said, so you can say, did you hear that? What did you think about that? Do you know what that is? Or maybe kids have already asked that. Or going to the zoo or something, there's monkeys doing things, and it's like you can have
Mm.
conversations. I don't know, like maybe as they're getting older and someone's like, what does that word mean? And then you can have a conversation about that. So yeah, I think you'll know best, but I also say to people that, we teach children lots of things, how to brush their teeth, tie their shoelaces, ride a bike, and all this kind of stuff. So it's like the best place to start is having a conversation about at home that's not full of shame, because I often say to people, if you shame them for saying that they watch that, they're probably not going to come to you if they're uncomfortable about something. It's around trying to say that a lot of people get really aroused, whether they're watching it on a TV show or the stuff that you see, which is obviously a bit more explicit, in porn, and trying to have a conversation without shame, but just sort of talking about it's not uncommon that people have those feelings, but also if you've got uncomfortable feelings, what's that about? So, really it's about, it depends. Some kids have come up and they're really young and they're asking these questions, but then I suppose as you get older and knowing that, hey, you're probably, you've got this phone, you're probably going to, just along with those other conversations about, being safe, not putting too many details. Often I've had conversations with young people about when they're being asked to take photos of their body. And I'm like, if you really want to do this after I tell you not to do it, don't put your face in it. Don't put any identifying things in, just stick your nipple in there. It's that kind of that thing of having a conversation about how do we do this the safest way? Because we all know that young people will sometimes, even adults do this. They do just do things when they're aroused, or they, without necessarily thinking of the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I think that's really great advice. And I agree with you that if we don't have these conversations, it's going to happen anyway. It's like not having the drug conversation. If you don't prepare the children for it, then they're going to do it without your help, and it's going to be more dangerous than if you just had a conversation
like the whole
about
thing of drugs. Maybe you're really like totally anti-drugs. You're like, don't do this, but your kid's going to eventually go to a party and there's going to be drugs, underage drinking, all of that. It's about how do we have a conversation so that they can feel really safe, and say if they happen to take drugs, they will not be too scared to ring you if their friends passed out or something like that.
Right.
So I suppose it's this thing of talking about that, and that part of that porn stuff is to have the conversations about, consent and text and sexting, or whatever language people want to use around that. But all of that is part of that conversation. And I suppose, there's ways you can do it. As I said, even if you don't say, hey, I know there's a lot of porn out there. Have you thought about it? And if you're one of those parents who's a bit more like, okay, I understand it's there, you could have a conversation with them about, if you're going to watch porn, have you thought about ethical porn? There's this whole new area that people have pushed back at, and understanding that some parts of the porn industry are really not okay. So they've pushed back and they've created another space that's safer. So you can have a conversation about that.
I love that. Thank you. This is exactly where we were going to go. So let's talk a little bit more about ethical porn. So my understanding is with ethical porn is that it's subscription based. Like the whole point of ethical porn is that people get paid properly and people have good working conditions, etc. And so if that is the case, then it kind of makes sense that children would access the free stuff because they are not going to have access. Which is
why we got to add the combo, right? But then tell them that there's there,
Right. So I remember we had a conversation about this in our intro call, and I thought this was such an exciting thing to talk about because it's kind of really controversial. We talked about the possibility of getting a subscription for your child. And you said there was a lot of legalities around that. Now, apart from the fact that I think a lot of people are going to even find this conversation quite confronting. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, like, if, you want your child, your child's going to consume porn, you want to inform them of the ethics of it. Two things, like, how can we kind of, it's kind of a weird thing to want to buy your
And it's funny, it's not. A lot of parents talk to me about this. I suppose it's the same thing about, like when I had a teenager once, and it's like, I let her have alcohol in my house in front of me so I could watch her, that kind of thing. And so she was very like sensible around lots of things, right? But this is that thing. So I do have parents ask me that. And I suppose, again, you have to know, usually you've got to be over 18, right? That's the thing. But I know that there are. So, yes, some of my parents will say, I'm going to do it. So they have for their 17-year-olds or whatever, they've got a subscription for them to look at it. But other people will just say, I can't do that for you. But once you're 18, there's this option. So I suppose I can't tell you, I mean, everyone's going to make their own rules up in their family, because I know I'm not the only parent who let their child drink alcohol in their house, so there's all the, you're
Yep.
going to make these decisions, but I think it's important that you at least give them the option and know that that's out there, because that just creates conversation anyway, right? You can say what is ethical porn, right? That this is the place that these directors were all not just about making money. Of course they want to make money, and most people do in any kind of business, but also knowing that the people that work for them are treated well, they're over 18, they're not trafficked. Also they're often directed by women, which is a different way of looking at it, and they're very much more about showing diversity and showing, yes, of course, there's fantasy scenes, but there's also much more real kind of ways that people have sex. So they're not just chosen for breast size, and people have
Right.
labia that hang out, and it's not all just tucked away, and penis size and all of those things. So just telling people about that so that they know that there's this option there if they would like to do that. And part of that is that you will pay because you want to know that those people are getting paid and things like that. So look, you have to make that decision for themselves. But I know there are parents who do that. Just like I know folks who I work with, a lot of people, it's another whole subject, but who have young people in their space with disabilities, and they've use their money to access sex workers, which is a whole nother story. But this is what dilemmas that some people face being parents and caregivers.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting. I used to be a behavioral therapist with children with autism, and there was a time when we had to do the sexuality. What did they call it? Kind of like
education.
training,
Yes.
like letting them know when it was appropriate to
Yes.
masturbate
Yeah.
and when it wasn't appropriate to
Mm-hmm.
masturbate. And the factor was that it was going to happen. This child's a 15-year-old boy. He's got autism, so he doesn't kind
Social stuff.
of have the
Yeah.
capacity. Yeah, he doesn't understand what's happening in his body for starters, and so he's got to learn that. And then he's going to learn where things are, where it's public and private, where things it's appropriate, it's not.
Yeah.
Okay, so with the ethical porn, one of the things you brought up when we had that call was that obviously we can't buy the subscription for the child because they're under 18. So we would have to buy the subscription for ourselves, and then they would obviously be consuming the subscription. Now, here's an interesting thing. I think when a lot of people think about children consuming porn, they think boys consuming porn, but there's a lot of women as well, young girls that like it. And there's different types of porn that cater to young women because, as you said, like it's directed by a woman. Women like to see different things. In my experience, when I've spoken about it with my friends, we like to see more real sex. Not so much this plastic or not to say that that's not okay or not enjoyable, but I haven't heard that to be the kind of porn that women I know want to consume. And just natural, like real women with cellulite
absolutely.
and
Pimples
women
on their
with bigger
bum,
bodies.
all that sort of stuff, hair, all of that. Yep. And that's the part of feminist / ethical porn. That's their goal, is to do that, at making it more realistic and things like that.
So are there any legal kind of implications if we did get a subscription and share it with our children?
I still don't know, because around every state is different, and they're still, to be honest, I feel like they're just catching up. Like they're constantly catching up with the sexting stuff and things like that. So technically, really, if you show, I suppose really, if you're not allowed to show anyone under 18 porn, right? So that's the thing. So yes, you can get in trouble. I suppose there's lots the same with the alcohol stuff, things like that. I think I can't remember what the last loophole with the alcohol is, if it's in your home, different to outside. Look, but I would say I don't know right now at this minute today, the latest I looked at still was you have to be over 18. So it's a crime to show someone porn under 18. So that's that sort of thing around trying to work out, your kid, right? And, we've got these laws, and just like the age of consent, there's, in most places it's 16, but in some states, I think it's still Tassie and South Australia, it's 17. But we know that there are parents absolutely facilitating that, letting their young people under that age stay under their house and have sex. It's that thing of having conversations, because some of these laws are supposed to keep you safe, but they also don't always make sense, right? Because you probably know, most of us know that there might be, or yourself, you may have been having sex younger and been in an okay, situation, the relationship is okay, but they've got to make some laws, right? So sometimes it's that thing of, yes, it's illegal, but how are you going to have this conversation? I suppose it's that thing of, they'll go find it anyway if you don't do that. But I suppose that's really a personal decision.
Okay. What about this scenario? What about if we are wanting to have these conversations with our child? We've come to the terms that we're having, it's going to be difficult and uncomfortable for
Mm,
us and
mm.
them. Are there any like places we could send them for resources so that they could perhaps watch a video without us necessarily being
Yeah,
there?
look,
Or
I mean, there's heaps and heaps of things on the internet, and some of it's great and some of it isn't. I know that there's like even on my page on the internet, I have a lot of sex positive websites that people can look at, get really good information. I said Scarletine is one that comes to mind, but there's also really great videos that people can look at around consent and different things. So I suppose that's one thing parents can do. Look up some of the sex education. I mean, lots of the different, like the sexual health service I used to work at in Adelaide has heaps of stuff online and can direct parents to give resources to young people, because we know that they like watching videos and things, short things as well. And that's got information that's not judgy and things like that.
mm-hmm. And what about if I'm just kind of like trying to go through all the
Mm,
scenarios in
mm,
my head of what could happen if you did introduce your child to porn? And again, of course, as you've stated many times, like your
mm,
child, but what if something happens where they have some sort of addiction?
mm,
They have they start kind of watching it too often. How can we kind of be supportive and regulate
Look,
that, knowing that if, let's say, we pulled that subscription, that if we did make that choice, that they could still access
absolutely.
free
And I
porn
think
anyway?
I don't use the term addiction with porn, but I certainly do, whether it's masturbation or sex or whatever. I call it problematic, or so clients will come to me if they think that it's problematic or maybe compulsive. And that's anything, because let's be honest, most people, like, we could say this about our mobile phones. That's a whole nother story,
Oh
right?
yeah.
But yes,
Yep.
obviously, I even without porn, some young people will masturbate a lot because they've got a lot of hormones going on. So I suppose it's really just having that conversation around, is this getting in the way? And I do this with anybody, whatever age, because I see a lot of adults too, around, is this actually hampering you from having like a good social life, things like that. So for some people, their masturbation, whether it's with porn or not, becomes the only thing that they feel good about. So we have conversations around what that is. So it's about just trying to do that, because really, again, people always panic about porn, and we know that there are a lot of people who are gaming for hours and they're not even outside. So it's that thing of, how do we have just a conversation saying, hey, if you feel like you're doing this too often and it's getting in the way and you can't do anything else, let's have a conversation about that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It just keeps coming out for me that I mean, I don't know if any of these kinds of parents would be listening to this podcast anyway, but that so many parents are going to be struggling
Sure.
with this. How can parents get support? Let's say they want to start having these conversations with their child or children, and they're just like, I am just really, really feeling really stuck, but I know it's important. How can I get some
So
support?
depending on where you are, look up the sexual health services or sexual health teams, and they will have online resources specifically for caregivers. Because like when I used to work at a sexual health service in Adelaide, so that's one, Shine SA. I used to work there, and they specifically made resources. And I know all the places, and this is within Australia, but also, okay, if someone's in the US, there's Planned Parenthood, there's plenty of, and Scarletine. There are places that are specifically, they'll go for professionals, and then they have resources that are just for parents to help you have that conversation. Here in Brisbane, it's called True, I think, and you would have heaps of places you're in Victoria, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So they've got some great stuff. So it's like, going on their resources, because what they want you to do is to be, we always come from the perspective of no shame, because children are not born feeling shame, they're taught it. And so we
Right.
just want them to be able to have the open dialogue, and look, they'll still often go somewhere else and ask other people questions, because it's just that weird thing of like, I don't really want to talk to my parents about this, but knowing that there's
Right.
this space. So it's so lovely that some people can then come to them and talk about contraception if they need it and things like that. So there's plenty of stuff
Mm-hmm.
online that's good, and not fear based and things like that, because I don't think that's helpful at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's so important, as you say, to have these conversations from an early age. And my girlfriend told me that her daughter, when she was young, I think she was like around 5 years old, asked like how a
Yeah.
baby's made, and she was like, "Oh, okay, this is happening
Uh-huh.
now." So then she's like, she talked about the ingredients. She said, "Oh well, there's mommy and daddy have ingredients, and we mix them together, and then that's how we made
Yeah,
you."
yeah.
And then I was like, oh, that's a really great way of explaining it. And then she was talking about with her partner, and she said, she was talking to their daughter and said, we don't want to say it only happens when two people are in love. We want
Yes,
her to know that mommy and daddy are in love, but it can
because it
happen
feels
also when you're
good
not in
and
love.
all sorts of,
Yeah,
yeah.
but yeah, because it feels good, but also two people said yes. But two
Mm-hmm,
people said
mm-hmm,
yes, and
mm-hmm.
then they decided to do this
Yeah.
together because they wanted to do
Yeah.
it because it
And
feels
let's
good.
be honest, young people are doing that. Children will often are very curious and they'll be sexual, and parents flip out when they find out that their kids will often, if they're an only child, they'll manage to do that with someone else. They'll find someone else to do it with a sleepover or something usually. So it's also about not shaming them and just saying, I understand this feels good, but we don't touch each other's bodies until we're a bit older, all of this stuff, but doing it without
Mm-hmm.
shaming them, because we just know that they're curious with a very different head, on them than we're looking at it through adult eyes. So I think it's important to kind of understand that. But yeah, I think my daughter was about 9 when she came in, and she overheard, gosh, this is how old I am, but I was watching Dawson's Creek and she happened to come out of the room. I think she was 9, or actually she was probably younger, and she came out the room and overheard the word orgasm. So that's how I had the conversation, even though I was already on my sort of journey of being a sex educator anyway. But she came out and said, what's that? And so I then said, oh, it's just this lovely thing that people can experience. And it's really nice if they're touching themselves. She's like, oh, okay. And then went back to bed. So that's how I had the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting as well because my friend's daughter was watching Shrek actually, and there's a scene in it where Shrek and I can't remember,
Yes.
Fiona, they accidentally get
Yes.
pregnant again, and her daughter was like, "Oh, mom, but how come she was surprised? Didn't they know that they were making a baby? Weren't they mixing the
Yeah.
ingredients?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, she's so switched
Yes.
on!" Like she was like,
Right at
even
it.
from this
And that's what I
cartoon.
mean. So there's often ways you can do that. So, like I said, if you've got a questioner like that little one asking questions, but
Mm,
some kids don't. So that's where I often say to people, I know it's uncomfortable. And I often say, don't have to sit down and sit down across and let's talk about this. It's more like just an ongoing convo. And, I often say to people, do it in the car when they're not facing you, just throw it out there in different things. Hey, have you heard about this? Or, or leaving, there's great books. And so you can do that around gender and all sorts of stuff, and putting those books there, and it might start a conversation. But I suppose really, if you can from the get-go, is just meaning it is an ongoing conversation that never ends. Someone's over and says, oh, so-and-so, did you see that? She's a slut. And then you're like, did you hear that? We don't use that word in here. What does that even mean? And have a whole dialogue there. Or, the radio,
yeah.
mainstream TV, there's so many
Mm-hmm.
things where you can use that to have a conversation about many things. So sex ed is not just about, P and the V. It's about so many things. Consent and,
Mm.
that stuff.
Yeah, I think it's so great. There's so many examples we can use, and like movies are a really great one. Like if we can use a
We
cartoon
can.
to explain
Because even in movies,
the,
because you're talking, obviously, we're having a conversation here about porn, but media does this. The sexual objectification of women and all of that is in
yep,
video clips. They just keep honing in on porn, but it's actually way bigger than that. Instagram, editing photos, just like all of it. So it's about how, trying to bring it to their attention so they can be a bit more, critical thinkers, really. What porn literacy is giving them a framework to look at when they see these images and unpack what's going on in there, and not taking it for face value that that's how it's real. Just like, imagine if we grew up knowing that every photo we saw in a magazine was edited. If there was a little sign on the bottom that said this photo is edited or photoshopped, so you would just, you grow up seeing, you would grow up totally feeling different about your body, right? So it's like being real.
yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad that that's getting
Mm.
better because I definitely was always like, oh, I've always been bigger than the other girls around me, and I always kind of made myself wrong because of it. But now, like, I've curated my feed, so there's a lot of bigger bodies
Yeah,
in my feed, big, beautiful bodies that have not been
not
photoshopped.
so good.
So it's like it's really interesting. I was talking to my girlfriend about how much my perception of myself has changed because
Yeah.
of my curated
And
feeds
that's
now.
exactly
And
what we do in some of my sessions. Often I talk to people, and when I used to run lots of workshops for young people at school around, if you're going to be on social media, I want you to do an experiment. Start following people who have different colored skin than you, who are able-bodied, disabled, folks on the spectrum, everything. And then just keep seeing, because eventually the algorithm is going to feed you that stuff. And then you will start seeing just such beautiful diversity, which can totally flip your mind, which has been taught only one thing. So if we do that,
totally,
that's one
yeah.
way to push back at it.
Yeah, other than seeing just women who look like
Yes,
me,
yes.
always always white, always this type of
Totally.
body,
And
you
there's
know.
amazing fat
Yeah.
activists on there who are just showing their body in sexual ways and throwing back, and they have beautiful ways of just coming back at all that crap that we're fed. So yeah, there's many ways you can do that.
I know, it is really beautiful. And it's really interesting even seeing the comments and processing, like even people saying, "Oh, you're so brave." And it's like,
Mm. Hmm.
mm, yeah. Having even conversations about that and all these kind of little
Yeah,
microaggressions and, what that even means and have we been contributing
for
to it as
sure.
well? Like
Yeah.
I remember reading Clementine Ford's book and going, "Oh my gosh, I've
Yep.
done things in this book and I didn't even
No, you
realize."
don't,
So
do
kind of,
you? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You just learn all this stuff and then you're like, where did that come
Yep.
from? I have a feminist mother, so I know it didn't come from her, but how, what pressures am I putting on myself because of the things I'm
For
seeing around me?
sure.
And
Yeah. And I think
yeah.
that's all part of it, like, I think you said in one of the questions there, like I was in Prague at a sexology conference and my title was raising sexually, porn literacy, raising sexually intelligent young people. And that's my whole thing around just, it's about porn, but it's about all the things, unpacking and looking at it and being real and giving them something rather than scaring the shit out of them so they don't do anything. It's like, or when something happens, they don't go talk about it. So it's like so many of my older clients would tell me they saw something and they were like, I was so disturbed by it, I didn't know what to say. Whereas if you have this whole dialogue going, you give them something to look at and go, oh, yeah, right, okay. Just like if they watch a scary movie, knowing that a lot of that stuff is just fake.
Mm. And I think as well, the way that you're talking about it, it's just kind of really matter of fact. It's not like making this big deal about
Mm-hmm.
something. It's like when a child falls over and skims their knee. If you like make a huge big deal about it, they're going to start
Yeah.
freaking out. But if you're just like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
are you hurt? Let's deal with it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'll be
Yeah.
right. I feel like a lot of kids like watch for their parents'
Reactions.
reaction.
Yeah. And that's that whole thing of just modeling back that there's this open dialogue and that they're there and they're not going to be shamed, because some people are like, right, if you watch porn, I think it was
Right.
Marty Klein at one of his things. He said that, it was something along the lines of, you watch porn, well, Uncle Jimmy got put in jail because he watched porn. Crap, the porn panic thing. It's like, just settle
Right.
down. Even if you're uncomfortable, and talk about, are they freaking out what they saw? They're like, oh my gosh, do I really have to do that? Do I have to have anal sex? And it's like, well, some people like
Yeah.
it, but some people don't. You need to actually ask. That's the thing they don't do in porn, really. You don't see the part where every single time you have sex, it's about questions, ongoing questions. Consent is not just a once-off thing, it's ongoing, but it's also like, oh, what do you like? Because you can't just, even though you might think, oh, that looks really cool when you see something on there, cool, but you need to ask the person, would they like to do that, or the people? So that's the conversations that are important.
And I remember, I'm just going to bring out one more thing before we wrap up because I think this is really important. My mother told me a story about, actually not too long ago, which is really sad, that a man said something very inappropriate to her. And my response was like, oh my God, you're so lucky I wasn't there. I would have just given it to him. And she said, well, that's your reaction, Talia, but my reaction is to freeze. And it was like so many people's reactions when they're in uncomfortable
Is that
situations are to freeze.
totally?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when she said that, I was like, oh yeah, I do too. But I guess because it was you, my reaction was
Yes.
anger. But if it was, I've been in the position where I've frozen before as well, and you're kind of like, oh my gosh, I don't know, like what to do here. And that's when you feel when you're unsafe, you're uncomfortable.
Totally.
There's been a breach of consent.
Mm-hmm.
So even talking about these kinds of
Yeah.
things, and explaining that, like no one said that to me when I was growing up. I didn't really have a conversation of, a freeze response.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
More often than not is to a clue that you're in a
That you're not
situation where you
feeling
feel
great.
unsafe.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in tune. And I think we're getting a little bit better at understanding we need to talk about emotional first aid and all those things. Let's talk about feelings and how to deal with all of those as well. That becomes, all part of this conversation.
Wow. I just, I feel like this is so valuable. Thank you so
Thanks for
much.
having me on.
No worries. But before we wrap up, is there any like piece of advice that you could give to parents listening to this, or even like friends of parents, godparents who want to be more helpful to
I
younger
just think
people
if you
in their lives?
can, even on the inside, if you're like, oh my God, what do I do? What do I say? To kind of just go, you don't have to be perfect. No, we've all got the stuff. So I think it's also about working on the stuff that we all had different messages, and a lot of it was silence or shame, but also that we can change that. So part of this is like that whole next generation of having different conversations. So also, that you might not get it right and it might be uncomfortable. And then you can say that. That's one of the other things. Say, listen, this is so uncomfortable for me to say. I'm not quite sure about this, but I just want to talk about it. You don't have to get it perfect. So just sort of, starting a conversation saying, you're probably going to feel really weird when I ask you this. I'm feeling really weird too, but I just want to say, I know there's lots of porn out there. Do you want to have a chat about it? If you see anything that made you uncomfortable, all of that, but admitting it, because you don't have to get it perfect. And there is heaps of things on the internet to help you start those conversations. I do it all the time. I have people sometimes book sessions with me, not necessarily for themselves, but how to talk to their young people.
Thank you so much for being here, Naomi. This has just been so enlightening. I just feel like we could talk for hours because this is just so important.
It's a good topic.
It is such a good topic, and I just think it's so important. And I don't know, I think because it's so uncomfortable for a lot of people to talk about, that they just are like, well,
they shut
I'm putting
it
you
off.
in the
and that's there are some
you're
people
in the
who
too
hate
hard
that
basket.
they don't agree with me even suggesting a porn literacy. They're just like, shut it off, and I'm like, that is not helpful. It's still there.
No,
just like
not helpful.
The drugs thing, right? It's still happening. So we've got to have the conversation. You don't, like I said, you don't even have to say, I suggest to people, don't try not to shame your kids, say it's disgusting, and that's not helpful. But you can say, I haven't watched it, but I know people do. So let's have a conversation.
Right. Yeah. I guess what was coming to mind for me is just there's so many parents who aren't watching porn, and so they couldn't imagine why somebody else might want to.
Exactly. Especially because maybe they're being sexual, and so children who aren't but are having sexual feelings, they're really curious and all of that stuff. So I suppose it's just understanding that, and that then that way what we're doing is helping them to be able to make informed decisions and be critical sexual thinkers around the decisions around all of that stuff.
I think one of the most important things that you've said today is if we don't have this conversation and make it safe, then they're not going to talk to us about it. They won't. And then you won't know. Things will happen and you won't know.
And that's the sort of key, is that you want to hopefully keep that line of communication open. So if they know that, even if it, like I said, it's probably going to feel weird, okay? And it might not go well. And you can stumble over your words, but that's okay. It's like all things, you'll get more comfortable as you do it. But like even just in that, usually older teenagers will often just go, okay, don't say that. Don't talk to me about that. But it's like, you've said it. At least you've put it out there going, I'm giving this a whirl and I'm not going to cut it off. Because usually what I see on the other end every single day is people who had nothing but silence or very outright shaming, which is also unhelpful.
Yeah. And it's so damaging. I know somebody who's married. She's brought up in a religious household, really important to her to be married. And her husband was telling me, this was a while ago, he's like, I can't have sex with my wife. I've told this story on the podcast before, but I can't have sex with my wife because she has so much shame.
Yes.
We're married and she still can't have sex with me.
They think it's going to just stop. And like I said, I see many clients a day, and this is a very familiar theme.
It's just heartbreaking. So
heartbreaking. It's awful. Yeah.
That's such a wonderful thing for people to experience. Why wouldn't we want to have this joy in our lives?
Exactly.
Well, Naomi, thank you again. And how can people find out more about you and get in touch with you if they want to?
So on Instagram, I do a lot of just using comedy on there. I usually do stuff around sexual health or awareness, relationship stuff, but that's Australian sexologist. But if you actually want to have an appointment, which I do face-to-face or online, you just can Google me, like Naomi Hutchings. It's www.naomihutchings.com. And then there's a booking system there.
Naomi, thank you so much. For anyone listening, you can find all the links mentioned in this episode at rebellove.com/EP37. You're a legend. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for being here.
Having a conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Rebel Love Podcast, the podcast about love, sex, relationships, and money. If you like this episode, please support us by subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. And find all the details of this episode and more at rebellove.com/podcast.